Well, Coach Hall, on behalf of Kentucky's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, I'm pleased to give you this year's Distinguished Rural Kentuckian Award.
Excuse me. Thank you. The Harrison Rural Electric Association gave me that job under false conditions. I apologize. If it means that you want this plaque back, I'll certainly understand. But I felt like that I did a good job. I cut right away with a two-man saw. And back then, they wouldn't let us leave knee posts. You all know what knee posts are? That's when you cut one that's about 3 feet off the ground. You had to get down on your knees and saw that thing right even with the ground. I worked for Bill Penn, and my supervisor was Curly Brown. Curly was a tough little old guy that worked hard himself, and he made us work hard. I'll never forget the first post hole I ever dug. They put me out by myself and went off. And somewhere in that hole, I hit a big rock. And I worked that iron digger till I had to pry my fingers off of it. And Curly came back and he said, Joe says, you didn't make that hole very big. He meant circumference. He said, we're going to have a hard time getting a pole in there. You better go up to the truck and get the pole greaser. So my first day out, I went up to the truck and got the pole greaser. And the guy asked for it, hand me a stick of dynamite. He said, take that to him. That'll grease that hole. But I lied about my Social Security, and I may be the oldest employee of the REA in this room tonight. That was 70 years ago. Has anybody in here worked at REA longer than that? 70 years ago, that's a fact. But it was great. I've always admired going through Harrison County and seeing what the REA did for those farmers. And I still see some of those right-of-ways that I first opened up are still there. I remember how we did on the farm without electricity. And true story, we had a battery-operated radio, no lights, no electricity. And we were sitting out on the porch one night. Our radio battery had gone dead. And we could see the lights from Cynthiana, about 6-7 miles as the crow flies. And we could hear horns blowing. And they were blowing so loud that we wondered what was going on. In Cynthiana, it was some kind of a catastrophe or celebration. 3 days later, we learned that the Japanese had surrendered. That's the way it was without electricity back in those days. What the people have done, what you all have done for the rural people in Kentucky has long been forgotten. But they are so much better off today than they were back in those days. It's amazing that we were so far back in time that we hadn't had those services that other people had enjoyed. So the Rural Electric Association in Harrison County thanks all of you today, and I do also. And to continue that story about being one of the Sorry Seven, the Sorry Seven weren't so dumb. They found out that Coach Rupp, out of desperation or more disgust with the way one of the Fabulous Five were playing, he had turned to whoever sitting next to him on the bench, and he'd grab you by the scuff of the neck, and he'd throw you towards the score table, and he'd say, "Get him out of there." So the Sorry Seven learned that after the pregame warm-up was to get to the bench first and get that seat next to Coach Rupp. We were playing the California Golden Bears. They were a good basketball team. They were coached by Pete Newell, later the Olympic coach, and they had a pep band there with them. And the cheerleaders had a little bear cub on a leash that danced around when their band played. And that night, I tripped Garland Towns, knocked Dale Barnstable down, and got that seat next to Coach Rupp. There were no referees coming off that floor. And during the game, California was so tough that I could see my chances just slipping away. The Fabulous Five were playing great, but the score was back and forth all through the first half. Second half, I finally resigned myself that there weren't going to be any substitutes tonight. I folded my arms across my chest, put my feet out in front of me, my heels out in front. Coach never said anything. The game got down to about 2.5 minutes. I put the fast break on Coach. I reached over beside his feet, got a cup of water out of the tray. As I came back, I just poured it down his pant leg and into his cup. Crossed my leg, kicked him on the shin, caught him with an elbow, and he turned and looked at me and he said, "Joe says you sit there and behave yourself. When Pete puts that bear in, I'll put you in the garden." I'd like to introduce my family first. Judy Derrickson, my daughter. Stand up, Judy. Judy is a CPA with Radwin and Brown in Lexington. My son, Steve. Up, Steve. Now, Steve is one of you. Steve graduated from the University of Kentucky Ag School. He worked with homegrown beef to develop that program. He became the family farm horse, tobacco, corn, apple trees, peach trees, cherry trees, asparagus patch, blueberry bushes, grape arbors, diversified farmer. And when the 1986 tax laws changed, it knocked the horse business to the ground. We had about 50 mares and foals on the ground. We dispersed. Steve went to Central Bank, where he's now a senior vice president in special assets. Former ag graduate, University of Kentucky. Proud of him. I have a granddaughter, Amy, lawyer, and her husband, Ben. And where's the little guy? My great-grandson. That's Joe Brack, lawyer. Can you imagine what we're going to call him? Little Joe B. Also with me is Jim Langster and his wife, Flo. Jim was the director of the Joe B. and Denny show, which we're miss very much, not having something to get me out of my pajamas in the morning. But it's extremely pleasure to be the recipient of this award. Gosh, for all the sticks of tobacco I've cut and hung in the barn and wormed and suckered and breathed that poison Paris green as I suckered tobacco. And for a long time, I held a record in Harrison County for 1,475 sticks and dropped my own. But I owe that to my uncle because we raised in the tobacco patch everything we did. When we wormed tobacco, we had worm fights as we went across the row. When we topped tobacco, we were breaking tops out of tobacco so fast. When we got to the end of the row, we probably had 3 plants in each hand that hadn't broke off. But what a great life spending those summers on the farm with my uncle. And I wouldn't trade anything in the world for it. The first day's work I ever did as a man, I was 9 years old, and I plowed corn with a mule. Also plowed with Old Beck in tobacco. And Old Beck never stepped on the plant. When she turned the end of the road, she was very careful, never to step on the plant. I loved that old mule. I plowed corn with a 7-shovel plow. And that night I went to bed, and all I could think of was corn passing me all night. But I want to thank you all for this award. I'm very proud to accept it, and just couldn't have a better compliment from a better group of people. Thank you all very much.